Welcome to Inside Crime, the Experts. In this series, we'll bring you updates on what is making the news in the crime genre in Australia and around the world. Our experts will take you inside some of the most challenging crimes and mysteries. Many of these are unsolved. They're the stories of serial killers, murders, organised crime, disappearances, scams, frauds and heists. And now to our experts. Tim Watson-Munro is Australia's leading criminal psychologist. He's delved into the minds and crimes of some of the most notorious criminals in Australia and around the globe. Dr. Xanthi Mallet is a world-renowned criminologist and Associate Professor of Criminology at the University of Newcastle. And lastly, I'm Duncan McNabb. I started my life of crime as a detective in policing and criminal defence and in the corporate sector before heading to the media as an investigative journalist, author and documentary maker. First up, some news. Brothers Eric and Lyle Menendez are back in the news around the world thanks to the Netflix drama Monsters and the accompanying documentary. These were the two chaps who in 1989 bought shotguns and then shot their parents to death as they watched TV in the family room of their Beverly Hills mansion. The boys' response, aside from demonstrations of grief, was to go on a spending spree in the luxury stores, restaurants and car dealers of Los Angeles at a time when, at least according to Hollywood, greed was good. But they were arrested and eventually convicted and then sentenced to life in prison without the prospect of parole. While there had been evidence that their father, Jose, a music industry executive, was a sexual predator who abused his sons and other young men, much of that wasn't taken into account at the trial. Our last news item is Gregory Lynn, a case we covered in the first episode of Inside Crime, the Experts. He was convicted in June this year for the murder of Carol Clay in Victoria's Alpine region, and at that very same trial acquitted of the murder of her companion, Russell Hill. Lynn has now been sentenced to 32 years with a non-parole period of 24 years. Tim and Xanthi have commented at length on this case, so what do you reckon?
Well, isn't this an interesting one? I mean, the case itself originally just seems such a bizarre situation that these two people died, after just some sort of argument, right? However, what really struck me as the case unfolded is, well, firstly, the lengths that he went to, that Lynn went to disguise the crime. He went back to the remains afterwards. He spent a considerable amount of time burning those remains till there was very little left. Over 2,000 different elements were recovered finally when he did disclose where the bodies were. But what really surprised me was the outcome. The one guilty verdict, one not guilty verdict. And I think, obviously, not disagreeing with the jury, but this is such an unusual case that I just don't think we've seen the end of it. I think we have some more twists and turns to come, because I think this one is just such a strange one. What do you think, Tim?
I read the sentencing remarks of Justice Croucher. He seems to have dotted the I's and crossed the T's pretty well. But I guess now he's being convicted. There's a high consciousness of guilt, in my view. 2,000 elements, as you describe them, they're bone fragments, as I recall. He waited a long time to return to the crime scene, and he took a lot of steps to evade detection until, I guess, inevitably he realised the ruse was up. I had the benefit of seeing some of the tapes of his police record of interview. It was something I did with Spotlight a couple of months ago on Channel 7. And it's chilling stuff. And it's chilling in the sense of his complete dissociation from the gravamen of what's being alleged. Two dead people. He's talking like, oh, well, the dogs died, with great respect to the deceased. He had no empathy. There's no signs of guilt, no signs of remorse. And as I recall, one of his major concerns was, would he still be able to play golf at the local club and so on? But nonetheless, he's given him 32 years on the top, which may as well be a life sentence for him, and a non-parole period of 24 years. My understanding is, subject, of course, to appeals and so on, that he would only be eligible for parole at the age of 79. 70, he'd be lucky to last that long. So, fascinating case. I agree, Xanth. We have not seen the end of this story.
I did a couple of interviews over the weekend, mostly about the sentencing, the length of sentence, and whether he would appeal.
I'm in Melbourne at the moment, and I've spoken with a number of criminal lawyers down here, and I forgot about this, but the law, as I understand it, was changed in recent times to remove the issue of double jeopardy in Victoria. So technically speaking, certainly according to one of the lawyers I spoke to, it would be highly unusual for this to occur, but it's legally possible for it to occur. The other thing that struck me about this case was his, crocodile tear letter of apology to the court, where he was bewildered, I think, bewildered by the outcome. He didn't kill anyone, he said, despite the fact that there's 2 dead people and so on. It again goes to the issue of remorse. And just to put it in some perspective or context, Julian Knight, who murdered a lot of people in Hoddle Street in 1987, he was given life with a non-parole period of 27 years. So, there's no, I think, diminishing the gravity of what he's been found guilty of, whether it's 1 murder or 2. I mean, clearly the family of the person that he was found not guilty of killing of would want some closure on that. But in real terms, this bloke's looking at a lot of jail ahead of him.
Yeah, and I think it's curious. That letter you were talking about, he called it a letter of contrition, I think. It was anything but contrite. He says he disagrees with the jury, is horrified that the jury had found him guilty of 1 and not the other. This is a bizarre case, and every time we look at it, it gets more and more bizarre. I suspect we'll have an appeal lodged within the next 28 or so days. That was on Friday, up to the appeal court. Probably going to be another year or so before an appeal is actually heard, if it goes ahead. And then who knows what's going to happen. I'm fascinated, as Tim's talking to lawyers, telling us that there may be an opportunity for the Crown to appeal as well. And so to our feature story, that fortunately rare beast, serial killer couples. Fred and Rosemary West raped and killed at least 12 young women over a 20-year period from 1967 to 1987. That included their own children. The West's house at Cromwell Street, Gloucester, where many of these crimes took place and where the ghastly couple dismembered and buried the remains of their victims, was demolished in 1996. 1 year before the West was stopped, and on the other side of the world in Western Australia, Catherine and David Birnie sexually assaulted and murdered 4 women over a 5-week rampage in October 1986. Fortunately, their 5th victim, Kate Moir, managed to escape after she was lured into their car and taken to the Birnies' home at the now notorious 3 Moorhouse Street, Willagee. It's a suburb in Perth's southwest. Kate's quick thinking and bravery brought an end to the Birnies' dreadful crimes. These are modern-day horror stories, and so do our experts to see what makes these deadly couples tick.
They recognise a common interest, and then how do they act on their fantasies? What started them? The Birnies, both born in 1951, Fred West, 1941, Rosemary in 1953. And then in terms of them being couples, who's the dominant party? I think that's worthy of discussion. It's interesting that at the end of it all, both men suicided, had made admissions to the police. Both women denied. However, then Kath pleaded guilty and Rose West was found guilty by a jury. Both became very dominant personalities in prison. So I don't know, Xanth, your area, how do they meet and how do they recognise the common interest? My area too, I guess.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting, wasn't it? How do you recognise those symptoms or signs of, I don't know, would we call this psychopathy? Are they sadistic psychopaths? Are they sexually sadistic psychopaths? I think certainly there's mixes of all of that in there, isn't there? They met, in the old-fashioned way, didn't they? And they're kind of like, by chance. But they met when they were young, didn't they? And I think that has allowed this kind of link between them to kind of develop, and didn't necessarily stay together or get together until they were a bit older. But for me, I don't know how you get across that edge of having that conversation. Is it just subtle cues to start with? I guess it's like anything, isn't it? It's like, how do pedophiles or child sex offenders, how do they recognize other like-minded individuals that they feel safe with? I guess cues are being given off that others of a similar temperament begin to pick up on and then encourage.
Well, flies have a genius for seeking out shit, don't they? I mean, being crude about it, and it probably starts sexually. They probably discuss their fantasies. They may be involved in sort of sadistic, sadomasochistic sort of relationships. And as with all these crimes, the fantasy then escalates to, I wonder what it'd be like to act out on the fantasy. And I think once it happens, becomes incredibly exciting for them and reinforcing, pleasurable, in a very perverse way, but pleasurable. And then they can't start thinking about the next crime that they're going to commit and so on. So I think that's what happens psychologically. It's the old issue. Are they psychotic? That is, are they crazy or are they just bad? If you look at the cases we're discussing today, unless I'm contradicted by psychiatric reports that haven't appeared, it would seem that these people were well-oriented in time, place and person. They knew what they were doing. They planned their crimes. They acted out on their crimes and they covered their tracks. I mean, the fifth victim who escaped was very lucky to get away. And of course, she was able then to notify the police and they were discovered. Had that not occurred, this is the other thing, it becomes an addiction. They keep going. And you look at all these serial killers. I was looking at John Christie, 10 Rillington Place in the UK. He was executed in 1953, but he murdered, I think, 8 people at the house, including his wife. She was buried under the floorboards. Others were buried in the walls of the home. He was more of a sole operator, but again, a person who was clearly addicted to killing people on a fairly regular basis.
And did he keep the bodies in the house because he wanted to keep them near him? Because sometimes, you know, these types of offenders do that, don't they? Sometimes it's the safest place to dispose of remains in that they have control of that area. But in other times, I think they're actually keeping the bodies in the walls, under the floors, wherever, almost as mementos, you know, that they literally keep their victims close.
Well, that's true. But then, sorry, Duncan, I did just one final point on that. He was detected when he moved home and the new people came in and they thought, boy, we've bought more than we bargained for here.
It's that secret knowledge, that power that they get from this secret knowledge. We know where the body, I know where the body is, but you don't. They feel powerful. They feel excited by it. They know that they can stand on top of a grave and realize that all around the world, no one knows what they're standing on.
I think there's a safety too, isn't there? If you keep them close, you know that nobody else is going to interfere with them. But I think it really, when we're talking about bad or mad, I think those countermeasures are really important, because somebody who is literally mad and acting outside the realms of, you know, sanity, they're not going to be undertaking all those countermeasures to cover their tracks over a significant period of time. You know, these people are holding down jobs, they're holding down other relationships. So this to me does not speak of madness in any way. I mean, it sounds mad. How could anyone do that and be sane? But ultimately, they absolutely know what they're doing is wrong, but their own personal gratification is more important than anything else. And they just don't care about their victims at all because they're psychopaths. They have no sympathy or empathy or remorse.
Just a curiosity for me on Birnie. I interviewed David Birnie's first wife. He'd had a couple of kids, or a child or two with her. Normal, rational, smart human being. And we were talking about it for a couple of reasons. One, to get some background, but also to look through the list of people that the Birnies had allegedly murdered, to see whether or not a couple of them were feasible, and one of them wasn't. But she said to me, and I always remember this, she said to me, you know, I don't think he woke up one morning and realized that he just wanted to be a serial killer. But at no time did this astute human being realize that she was married to a guy who would go on to be one of the worst sexual predators and serial killers in our history. It always fascinated me that he managed to meet Kath Birnie in social functions, and then that relationship developed until they decided it was appropriate to start kidnapping women off the street, luring them into the car. And this is a point that always also grabs me with so many of these people. Kate Moir, the victim number 5, who got away from the girl who was responsible pretty much for bringing an end to the Birnies regime in Perth. She was about 16 or so years old at the time when this happened. She'd been at the pub having a couple of drinks on a Friday night. She was walking home. A couple pulled up in a car beside her and offered her a lift. She's a smart, astute human being. She's looked into the car and thought, oh, this is okay. There's a woman in the passenger seat. So she hops in the back of the car drives off. And then she realizes, of course, that there are no door handles or anything. She's trapped in the back of the car and the nightmare starts for her. But the reason she got in that car because she saw a friendly, smiling woman in the passenger seat. So her risk assessment immediately dropped.
And that's the interesting thing, isn't it? With male-female couples, they often do lure people in, victims in, because you have the presence of the woman, and that makes other females feel safer. I also wonder whether these couples who just come together just by awful chance, whether they perhaps wouldn't have gone on to commit any crimes in isolation. It's the sum of the parts kind of getting together that creates this awful mix that they're egging each other on almost. And so, you know, is it just happen chance that these terrible personalities get together and that, you know, these victims wouldn't have happened without them?
It's just bizarre. I have no basis for this, but I'm just wondering whether or not with these couples, is there a dominant person? Because I always got the impression with the Birnies that Kath might have been pretty much calling the shots, and David was a very, very willing henchman.
Who knows? I didn't examine them, but it seems to me these cases that it's sort of yin and yang in a way, that there's a mutual kind of attraction to a common purpose. Who knows? They might role flip. One may be dominant one time, one may be dominant the next time. I think what happens is they're both enlivened and sexualized by the experience, and that in itself for them is very pleasurable. There's voyeuristic components to what you're describing. They like to watch, they like to see pain being inflicted on the victim, and they like directing play. And look, this sort of stuff goes on in sadomasochistic relationships from time to time, but this is next level sadomasochism, isn't it? Where somebody ends up dead.
Back on the West, I'm always fascinated by how they dispose of their victims as well, because as we know, some serial killers just don't care. They dump them on the side of the road. They dump them wherever it suits them. Both the Birnies and the Wests were quite almost meticulous in what they did. In the Birnies case, they took their victims to pine forests on the outskirts of Perth, both north and south, and buried them quite discreetly in those woods. You wouldn't have found them. And the only reason the Birnies victims are found is because the police inveigled Mr. Birnie to show them where a couple of them were. Not all, but only a couple. The Wests are intriguing because they actually interred them in their own house, and I think a couple of their victims are also dismembered, which is very much in the news in Australia at the moment, I might say. But how the hell does that happen?
And also that some of them were their own children.
Yep.
So that's, again, another layer here, isn't it? They weren't only targeting strangers who came to the house, they were actually killing their own children.
Without wishing to get grisly, we'll give a how-to guide for anybody. I've always found the notion of dismembering someone particularly horrific.
Well, I have done dissection, legal dissection, and it's really hard work, especially if you don't have any anatomical knowledge. And the cases that we've seen recently, and actually most of the cases that I've looked at in the past, if somebody doesn't have anatomical knowledge, they often buy a little hand saw, like little hand electric saw, often from Bunnings. Everyone goes to Bunnings to buy their goods, don't they? And then they seem to keep the receipts for some reason anyway. But yeah, they literally will buy hand saws. So it's not an easy thing to do. It's very labor intensive, and it is very, very messy, very messy.
5 litres of blood. And
yes,
we know from crime scenes we've all been to that a little bit of blood goes a long way.
It does.
The drama of a blood-soaked crime scene doesn't necessarily mean the person is dead, because blood has an incredible impact, particularly on your eyes when you walk in and you're confronted by it.
They were basically dismembering the remains down in the basement, when it's a very controlled environment again. But imagine, you know, how much forensic evidence would have been down in that basement with a number of victims, and they were buried down in that basement whilst they still had space. And then they had to obviously come up with different plans when they ran out of space in the basement, and they started burying them in their garden, I believe. And I still remember the images of that house when all of that was being disinterred, the remains were being recovered, and the garden was being dug up. And I remember just not being able to believe what we were watching on the news. And then that house was demolished. The West House, I believe, was demolished because it was just this symbol of this atrocity that happened in a very normal suburban street with all these bodies buried in the basement.
And I would imagine contemporary forensics would make this place an absolute field.
Oh, you can imagine how it would light up now.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. You use that laser thingy, don't you?
Yeah, it's so sharp. I mean, and that's the thing, people don't realize. They think that you can clean blood up quite easily, but actually with all the different techniques now to actually show blood spatter, and like if you just drop something, how far the spatter will spread, even just one little drop. Imagine when you actually either hitting somebody on the head bleeds load. It's like very highly vascularized, great blood supply. So you hit somebody on the head, it's like, it travels an awfully long way, and it is incredibly difficult to tidy up a scene to truly get rid of all of that forensic evidence.
Another thing that just comes to mind as well, and both Fred West is dead, David Birnie is dead. David Birnie committed suicide in prison. Rosemary and Kath Birnie are still alive. They're still serving extensive prison sentences, and hopefully they will never be released. But there's this quirk that I found just looking at the Birnies case. Kath Birnie was very active as a pen pal. One of her pen pals was Myra Hindley.
Oh. These like-minded spirits kind of share it. What are they writing about?
No one's ever actually had the letter. I'm told that she was writing to Myra Hindley and the US serial killer who
Eileen Moorhouse.
That's her. Yeah, that very, very strange relationship. They've sought each other out and been writing to each other merrily for quite some time. I just find that's bizarre. I would be very fascinated to see what the letters contain.
So do you think she wrote to Myra because she was one of the Moors murderers then, obviously with Ian Brady, another very, very famous serial killing couple? They killed a number of children. And I remember this too, because they kept going back to the Moors murderers, trying to get them to disclose the bodies of the remains, because they actually buried the bodies out on the moors, didn't they? I think that they were active between 63 and 65, and they were 5 children, I believe, between 10 and 17 that were killed, and they were sexually assaulting those children as well.
I've read the material concerning them. It's heartbreaking stuff, children pleading for their mothers and so on. And, evil simpliciter, those two, they're all evil, but, kids are next level, aren't they? And they clearly enjoyed what they were doing, clearly well planned, clearly evaded and so on. And I agree, then finding a pen pal on the other side of the planet to discuss your morbid crimes with, I'm amazed that they allowed that to occur.
Because they obviously sought them out for that reason. And I remember, because obviously I was in the UK, I grew up in the UK, lived there till 2012. 2 of the victims were discovered in 1965 out on Saddleworth Moor. And then in 1987, there was a further dig and they found a 3rd victim. Well, for our listeners, if you look at Saddleworth Moor, there are really no landmarks. It's just this open space. And so even if you wanted to disclose where the remains were, it might be very difficult 20 plus years after.
Intriguing point that you make there, because I walk around where the Birnies buried some of their victims. And it's an interesting point. They were always buried in pine forests, and there's no such thing as a landmark in a pine forest.
Look at Malat. Although those bodies were not actually part of the Langlo State Forest, the pine forest part of it, you've got to drive through a lot of pine forests to get to where the bodies were discovered.
Yeah.
But Malat did, because Tim and I spent a lot of time out in Belanglo, didn't we, when we were doing the documentary Buried Secrets on Ivan Malat. But Ivan did leave them by specific landmarks. And we do believe he went back to them, didn't he? Do you remember there was that big rock by a couple of victims? So if you knew the fire trails in Belanglo well enough, you could in fact orientate yourself around and return to those scenes where those bodies, because he didn't very casually buried them under some leaves and debris, but he could actually go back and genuinely spend time with his victims because they were surface depositions.
And there were rocks and there were roads.
Tim, what do you think about the fact that the males suicided and the females didn't? Is that a control thing? Because we often hear that with serial killers, don't they? They may go out in, death by cop, for example, because it's that final level of control. It's like, okay, my run is done, but you're not taking me in. I'm making the choice for me. So is that what they're doing? Is they, I don't know, suiciding as that last element of control of what's going to happen to them?
Or the flip side to that is that they don't want to be controlled. And so, as you say, they go out on their own terms and so on. Some would say perhaps it's cowardice. Some might say because there's no more opportunities to live out their perverted fantasies, life's not worth living. I think it's quite complex. But you start from a baseline of you're dealing with highly troubled, psychologically ill individuals, not out of touch with reality, and people bearing in mind that their only interest is self-interest. So they'll do it on their terms when they want to. And this happens, you know. No loss, some would argue.
Yeah, I remember when doing the Birnie story a couple of years back, David Birnie didn't adapt to prison life at all well. And in fact, he was desperately keen to reunite with Kath, and they wrote to each other regularly and that sort of stuff. Kath, bizarrely, seems to have at least made a reasonable fist of being in prison. There is a fascinating photograph of her appearing in a prison musical as the Mother Superior in Sound of Music. And there's this other bizarre story in Perth. There were a couple of lesbian vampire killers who tracked down a young girl, murdered her, drank her blood, all that sort of stuff. A horrific story. Kath became their mentor in prison, and she developed some sort of strange relationship with them. Just curious, and this goes back to talking to the Birnies, and I think it applies to a lot of them. David Birnie wasn't the smartest person in the world, and neither was Catherine, but they have, I don't know, rat cunning, I suppose.
Well, that's like Ivan Milat, isn't it? He,
yeah.
I don't think, was the smartest in terms of intellectual capacity, but rat cunning, a level of charisma, charm when he wanted it.
Sufficiently intelligent to not be classified as intellectually disabled. There was no defense of, look, our IQ was so low that we didn't understand what we were doing. They may not have been Mensa material, but certainly sufficiently bright to fantasize, plan, and then carry out very brutal, sadistic, psychopathic crimes.
And to get away with it for a considerable period.
Yeah. So the issue of intelligence is always interesting. It's something that pops up in court from time to time.
So the bottom line is you don't have to be a criminal mastermind to get away with a lot of this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
West were at it for 20 years. The Birnies, I think, were actually, well, the rampages allegedly for about 6 weeks. I think it was a lot longer. I think in the Birnies case, there are other victims, one I'm absolutely confident about. And they started about 6 months before the rampage, probably in about April 86 or thereabouts before they escalated. Then they went quiet for a while. Nothing happened in Perth. And it was weird because apparently they had a house guest. As I dug deeper into the case, they had a house guest living with them, an innocuous little human being who was living with them in their house in Willagee. And when that house guest left, they went back to their business
so
again.
They literally prevented them from offending because there was somebody else there and it was too risky.
And then there's this quiet period. No one's abducted in Perth. And then back in October, they resume. And I think this always bugged me. It's not what they did, it's what they didn't do that the investigation really stands out. So
Cheryl Renwick and Barbara Weston, those two, yeah?
Cheryl Renwick particularly. Barbara Weston I'm reasonably confident about. Cheryl Renwick, I interviewed Cheryl's daughter, and the police failed to do this, I might add, back in the day. But when I spoke to them about 6 or 7 years ago, Cheryl Renwick's daughter and her close friend were at the house that day on their own. Cheryl was out somewhere, and they identified Kath Birnie knocking on their door. The Birnies had been stalking Cheryl Renwick. And then Cheryl disappears. Her car is found. The police do bugger all, to put it politely. The investigation is haphazard. And then a couple of months later, they go very quiet. And we find out that they actually had a house guest. And when the house guest goes, they resume their terrible crimes.
Well, what it shows is they can actually control their impulses with the right sort of structure. And they don't want to be caught. These people have a chameleon-like ability to blend into the community. He could be a father, he could be a happily married guy, he'll have a job, and lo and behold, when he was arrested, suburban guy, everyone's deeply shocked by it. So the point is, Duncan, I think they can stop and start because they don't want to be detected, for one thing, and if there's people around that may be aware of what they're doing, they don't want to inveigle them into the plot. Very controlling.
Yeah, it's curiosity too, and that they're also, it's when the point you just make, it's their absolute ordinariness that the person next, which makes,
Middle-aged white guy living in the suburbs.
yeah. Do they
Or
reach?
woman.
Yes.
Or woman in this case, but it's the ones you don't suspect. That's how they're getting away with it. They're just your neighbor, and I'm not, I'm not trying to freak everyone out, but they're just your neighbors or somebody you see at the coffee shop or whatever. They don't have horns in a tail, which is why they're not standing out as huge risks.
Do they reach a sort of time, and I've noticed, just an observation, that some of the serial killers, both couples and individuals, also reach a time when they just slow down? Does middle age have an impact on their horrible deeds?
Well, age slows us all, but middle age doesn't slow you down that much. And I think there are other dynamics in play, but the point is that they can control it, and they're driven by self-interest. And if it's getting a bit hot in the kitchen, they'll get out of the kitchen for a while.
And isn't there some argument that as men get older and potentially testosterone levels drop, if their crimes are driven by sexual gratification, which they often are, that the actual need to do it lessens as well over time? Because we all think, don't we, serial killers don't just stop. They either die, they're imprisoned, or they move away, or over time, their actual desire to commit those crimes actually drops away.
Well, I think that's true too. I don't think it's one size fits all. There's many dynamics at play. And of course, some may die. They fall off the radar because they're not living anymore. Relationships may end. The stress or start. Yes, quite correct. They may enter a new relationship where the need to do it or finding a killing partner is non-existent, and so they just blend back into society. And so,
well, like Ivan Milat, he offended when he had a stressor in his life, often a breakdown of a personal relationship, and when he was under some psychological strain, he would go out and select victims. When his life was more stable and he was in a relationship, people were safer.
Speaking of relationships, on sentencing with the Birnies, Justice Wallace said that they should never be released, and Catherine should never see her partner again. And yet they exchanged some 2,000 letters. Quite extraordinary. That's a lot of correspondence, by the way.
That's a lot of vigorous letter writing. Interestingly enough, when Kath Birnie has been applying for parole fairly regularly, every time she does put a hand up for parole or to be considered for parole, Kate Moir, the girl who got away and is such a remarkable advocate, Kate Moir does a fine job in making sure Kath doesn't get out the door of that prison. For my two bob's worth, Kath should remain in there until they carry her out foot first.
Absolutely. They should never be released.
Well, she's a voice for those who didn't make it in many ways.
I think in the case of the Wests and the Birnies, the punishment certainly fits the crime. Thanks, Tim and Zanti. Now, in the next episode of Inside Crime with the Experts, we'll take you into the dark side of dating apps. They're fertile ground for an array of predators, from fishers and fraudsters to stalkers, sex offenders hunting their prey, and murderers. Thanks, everyone, for watching Inside Crime, the Experts. See you next time. And please like our channel and please subscribe.